question is specifically structured around our SABOA Operations Committee and two of the major issues that we deal with on a regular basis. And the one is the cost of fuel, and the second one is the challenge of implementing BRT. Our BRT speaker hasn't arrived yet, but I'm sure she'll be here a bit later. I think you'll agree with me that the cost of fuel has a major impact in our industry. Cost of fuel in a typical bus company makes up a significant percentage of our total cost, and depending on the timing in terms of what the price is at the time and the kind of operation, it is normally in excess of 25% of your total cost, and it's normally only your personnel cost that is a higher cost in terms of total cost than the fuel. Heinz earlier mentioned, I think, that at the moment they're running at about 30% of total cost is due to fuel. And unless you have a very good fuel formula in your fuel escalation formula in your contract, it can really make or break a company. It's therefore important for us as bus operators to know what's going to happen to the price of fuel in the future, if you can predict it, and how long this current honeymoon is going to continue. And the person who's going to tell us all about this is Mr. McHardy. He's got a BSc in Mechanical Engineering. He's registered with the Engineering Council of South Africa as a professional engineer. He started his career as a project engineer in the petrochemical industry. Is that right, Neil?
That's correct, yeah.
And then went on into the executive side of management at ENGEN in the corporate planning division. And for the last 12 years, he's been in the strategy department of ENGEN, focusing on sales in the marketing area of the business, with strong linkages to refining and supply logistics. So there's no one better, Neil, than you to tell us what we can accept, and we're gonna hedge our price depending on what you say today. So it's quite important you get it right. Thanks, Neil. Over to you.
Francois, thank you for that kind introduction, and I understand from that you're a man that can tolerate a high degree of risk. My name's Neil. Please, as I go through the presentation, if you want to ask a question and it's burning, let's do that at that time. Otherwise, at the end, I'm sure there'll be a bit of time. There are about 16 slides, so I'll move through most of them fairly quickly because they're fairly general background. I'm very familiar with the material, so for me it seems instinctive, but if it's not clear to you, please make sure that I review it for you and explain what it's about. First of all, a disclaimer, just because we are risk averse, and a further disclaimer to the corporate one is that what I say is largely my view. So if you don't like what I say, please don't blame ENGEN. You can happily blame me. I have no problem with that. The contents, I'll go through a background. I think it's important to understand a little bit about what is crude, what is refining, what sort of things drive price, and what makes supply happen or not supply. And those are very broad things that it's nice to have in one's back pocket when you then want to have a look at what happens in South Africa, what the current situation is, and what a long-term forecast might be on the volume side. Pricing in RSA is largely driven by regulation, but not solely, and I'll explain the linkages between RSA pricing and what happens in the world. So crude oil is a pretty general thing. It's almost like saying a bus is a bus. That's not true. There are various crude oils, and the way that they are priced is normally off a few benchmark prices. So for instance, take a bus, a benchmark crude you will all be familiar with is Brent oil. Now that's a specific brand and type. So that's like saying a Mercedes bus. But another equally good bus will, in the oil industry, be marked off Brent. So it'll be a couple of dollars less per barrel or a couple more. Now that doesn't happen in your industry, but just to understand that when the news reports the price of crude oil is X for Brent, It's got nothing really to do directly with the other ones, but it influences it. And the differential between the benchmark crude price and the crude that you might choose to buy is driven by quality and availability, location, its properties, and a whole bundle of things. So that's how it's done. The other thing to understand is that despite what is put about in the general news, the USA is still a net crude importer. And I'll show you the numbers later. It's buying the majority of its crude from Canada. It previously used to buy in from the Arab world. It's reduced Arab world purchases, increased purchases from Canada, and so people start to say it's independent. But the USA and Canada are two different countries. And I don't think there's any doubt about that one. They talk in the oil industry about conventional crude. This is the crude that typically comes out of one of those little nodding donkey things that you see in the movies, or a shallow water crude oil rig. So you get it quite easily, and it pumps quite easily. It has a consistency of thick oil. That's what it, and it's black and nasty stuff. Just as a matter of information, you might hear words like sweet and sour when people talk about crude. This is because historically, the people that evaluated the crude used to physically taste it. They would taste it in their mouth. And the sour crudes have high sulfur, and the sweet ones have low sulfur. So that's just carried forward from history. Unconventional crude, typically things like the crude oil Canada supplies. It is in the sand. What they do is they actually pump steam into what looks like a desert. They heat it, and that way they get it to flow, because it's so thick it doesn't flow. So the cost of getting it is more expensive than just something which is a bit like a borehole. And then what it is looking like, and this is a fairly recent trend, about 10 years ago, all the refineries that were being built to process heavier and higher sulfur crudes, because initially the conventional crudes that were easy to get, low sulfur, easy to process, had been used. So the world drifted to these heavy crudes, and you need a much more expensive, complex refinery to process it. What has happened now with the fracking oil, and one must distinguish between oil that comes from fracking and gas that comes from fracking. The process is essentially the same, but the product is different. The fracking oils tend to be light. So that's put a slight shift on what's happening. When a refinery is built, it's generally built for a specific set of crudes. Not only is it built for that crude diet, it's also built to service a given market. And the market slate of how much petrol, how much diesel, how much paraffin, how much LPG varies country to country, region to region. So what happens when the crude that you used to be able to buy is no longer available to you, you have a problem. If you are a not pork eater and there's only pork available, you've got a problem. Typically what happened, you would have all known about the Iranian sanctions. South Africa used to process a lot of Iranian crude, and its refineries were designed for that type of crude. So to switch and make an alternative was quite a mission for the oil industry. And of course there were price differences. The other thing is, once you've designed your refinery and you've chosen how much diesel or petrol that you want, you can't suddenly decide that you want to double the amount of diesel. You can make a small shift in it, but not a big one. You can squeeze 2 extra passengers on the bus, but not 50% more passengers. So there's a great similarity between the refining industry and the bus industry. Currently, because of recent building, particularly when oil prices were high, people that had their own crude started to build very large refineries, and they were very efficient refineries, very expensive, and their objective was to make money from being able to sell the finished product, but the real money lies in the crude. What we talk about is this refining margin, the difference between the cost of buying the crude and the money you get having processed the crude and sold all the product. That would be the gross margin. Margins on refineries are typically fairly low. I'll show them to you later. And to give you an idea of diesel, somewhere between 25% and 65% of the crude you put in, you can get out as diesel if you choose to do it up front and you choose the right diesel. At the 25% level, it's pretty easy. At the 65% level, it gets a little bit more tricky. Okay, obviously, for diesel pricing, the one big thing is the crude oil price, because that's the incoming price. Crude oil price moves on supply and demand like any other commodity. Please come in, have a seat. I'm just rolling on. The refining margin, what drives the refining margin is mostly scale. And I think it's fairly similar for a bus. You can probably make more money on a big bus providing you can fill it. The quality and the specification, the better the quality of fuel you can produce, the higher price you can demand. And you must be aware of typically legislation driven by the European Union and the clean air guys in the US, and that's all driving vehicle emissions lower and lower. That requires different engine technology, and to support the engine and exhaust technology, you then need a fuel that can support that. Cost of shipping. Not all countries have crude. South Africa is one of them, so all our crude is imported. Some countries are very fortunate and have their own crude. So if you have a local refining, it is cheaper to transport crude than a finished product. Crude is fairly stable. You don't have flashpoint explosion problems. You don't have oxidation issues because you're going to fix it later. So having a local refinery, you might win, providing it's a competitive refinery. All governments levy taxes and duties. Some governments give subsidies, but very few. Typically, some of the oil-producing countries, they subsidize the fuel that goes out. But most other places, governments find it a very convenient source of income. And you would have noticed a small shift in the recent budget. And that's, government needs some money, so it's a good place to get it. Like everything else, cost of inventory, it's a holding cost, and fuel is an expensive item. You need to pay for that. In South Africa, we have NERSA, which is a subdivision of Department of Energy. They are empowered to regulate the maximum price for a non-owner to use someone else's uncommitted capacity. So the equivalent for your industry would be that there would be a body that says, if you have not managed to place a passenger on your bus, the maximum price you can charge for someone else putting a passenger on your bus is X. That's the sort of environment that we work in. Or if you have a bus that you are not using, someone else can hire it from you for Y. And what this does is it helps non-traditional large oil companies start in the business without having to lay out the large amounts of capital. Of course, the seller, whoever this might be, it might be the garage, it might be a wholesaler, that guy needs to make some money. Supply and demand, when things are short, prices always go up. there are competing products, not only for diesel, but for others. You would have heard about CNG and LNG. This is just natural gas in different forms. At the moment in the world, it is priced to compete as an energy fuel. So its price is very low. And that way they can get people to switch from diesel and heavy fuel oil to natural gas. That will influence this price. Bunker fuel oil, what is happening, same as what's happening with vehicles, the emissions from ships are becoming a problem. There is legislation called MARPOL. I won't go through it in detail, but effectively it says clean up the fuel the ships use, and that falls in a range very close to diesel. So as that changes, there will be an impact on the supply and demand in diesel. World supply, this is just a quick scan. It's public information from EIA, the Energy International Association. And this is in millions of barrels of crude per day and who is producing it. So at the top you'll see Russia, Saudi, US, Canada, China. If you want to do the arithmetic, remember the numbers, but that's just for quick reference. This is who is using it. And if you look at the difference between what the US uses, 19, and what they produce, wrong button, round about 12, you'll find that there's a small difference. That's coming from somewhere. At the moment it's Canada. So that drives my argument that they are not independent. A history of world crude prices, like any commodity, they go up and down and shoot all over the place. The part towards the right-hand side of the graph, if I can drive that, is the recent history that people remember of high crude oil prices, but they were low for a very long time. Low at around about $20. Current price at about 60, and the future, well, who knows? That way. Diesel consumption, getting closer to the product you're interested in. The data stops at 2008, which is dated. However, the trends have not changed. What you're seeing there is a trend which increases distillate, diesel, and you're starting to see gasoline consumption tail off. So it's an interesting trend, and it is driven by engine technologies. It is driven by mostly Europe swinging from petrol passenger vehicles to diesel. US is the other way around. They may change. And most interestingly, if one looks forward, it starts to look like there might be some kickback against diesel in terms of it's going to be more difficult for diesel engines to meet the fuel emission, the exhaust emission requirements in about 10 years' time. Not happening now. It's a long way down the road. World refining margins. This is from just 3 different areas. But to just really why I wanted to put this up was to show you, whoops, wrong button, the sort of level of an average refining margin. About $5 a barrel. So when you're paying $100 a barrel for your raw material, and your gross margin is $5, you're in with a bit of a problem. And that's where the refining business has been for some time. And that's why only the very large refineries manage to be successful, and why you read often in the papers and general press of small refineries being closed. Generally, the smaller the scale, the lower the margin, and they just cannot keep alive. I think the American word is shut it. Conclusions about the world supply? Well, the USA is still buying plenty, so that's not a problem. There is a balance, approximately, between supply and demand. there's no significant shortage. The diesel volumes are increasing, and the impact of MARPOL when it comes. Originally it was going to be 2018, it got put out. There's another fancy commission looking at it again. I don't think it's of interest to your industry, but just be aware of this thing called MARPOL. RSA volumes. What I've done here is plotted petrol volumes on the blue line, diesel volumes on the red line. I just want to caution you, the scale is not 0 at the bottom, so it's one of these very clever ones to frighten you in terms of scale. More interesting, I think, for quite a few people might be this green line, which is my guess on the diesel that went into the road. The difference being the diesel that Eskom ate. So you can see this concept that they've been burning a lot of diesel is real. But despite that, there has been generally sufficient diesel everywhere in South Africa. The forecast volume, those are volumes that I think are plausible. If things stay roughly on track, economies stay roughly on track, politically we stay on track, and South Africa goes according to the plans that we have. An increase in diesel volumes, similar to the trends that have been worldwide, a small decrease in gasoline volumes, and the net average being a slight rise, because efficiencies will allow the vehicles to travel more kilometers, and more people will become vehicle users or passengers on vehicles. So that's the way I would see it going, and I've limited it to road diesel. The Eskom side is a very different story because they have quite a few options open to them. So that's my forecast. In terms of South Africa, even those increased volumes, the current infrastructure can handle it. There are sufficient ports, pumps, import places, pipelines coming up to the reef. So as long as everyone behaves nicely, maintains the equipment, schedules it properly, there's absolutely no problem. The infrastructure might need some upgrading when we talk about clean fuels too, and this is simply a quality issue. You can no longer allow a bit of dust to get in there, and dust gets everywhere in South Africa. You can no longer let water creep in places where it used to creep in. So there are small things like that where the distribution network will have to get cleaned up to be able to deliver to those new specs. The common distribution infrastructure, there are similar implications for other products. One of the issues is that at the moment, the DJP, the Durban-Johannesburg pipeline, it's owned by Transnet. All the oil companies use it. It has historically carried petrol, jet fuel, and diesel. It's an interesting multi-product pipeline. The way you manage the change between the petrol and diesel and or jet fuel, that's called the interface. Because depending on the specs, it can only go to one place. You can't put petrol in jet fuel, you'll have a disaster. You can't really put petrol into diesel because it doesn't work that well. However, you can get a little bit of diesel and jet into petrol if you blend it very carefully. So that is currently the way that it's managed. If the interface becomes too large and cannot be blended, it is taken to a facility where it is refractionated and split into its components by distillation. So that's where we are. To get an idea of South Africa, in terms of the world, we use 1% of the diesel. So whether our demand increases a bit or decreases a bit in terms of the world scale, there's just no issue. South Africa is currently a net importer, so the additional volumes it needs, it can just continue to import. Pricing. We have a import pricing methodology in South Africa. It's largely driven by the Department of Energy, and it is part of the logic in the workup of the diesel price. So the idea is, if I can import it at a given price, that's the starting place for the selling price. If you can manufacture it and be much better than that, good luck to you. And if it costs you more to manufacture it than that price, bad luck for you, you better think hard. And that obviously changes. South Africa has rather old refineries, and they're rather small scale. They were built in the range of 40 to 60 years ago. They are different technologies because they were built by a Shell or a BP or a Mobil at that time. They have different technologies, so they behave slightly differently. Of course, we also have Secunda, which is not a refinery. We must never mistake Secunda for a refinery. It's a totally different thing. It is a coal to gas and then gas to liquid machine, and that's not refining. The quality of fuel that you can get out of it can be absolutely superb. But the equipment you need is probably an order of magnitude more expensive in capital. But then coal doesn't cost $100 a barrel. So everything comes out in the wash at the end of the day. Also, the Seftel process allows them to make a wide spectrum of chemicals. The majority of crude oil refiners in South Africa are not able to produce any significant amount of chemicals, and that makes us quite different to the large refineries in Europe, the US, and in the East, where a crude oil refinery is typically linked to a chemicals production network. So the business is a little bit different. Currently the world, fortunately for us, there are more refineries than there is finished product requirement in terms of capability. So that means refining margins are relatively low. So anyone with an older, smaller refinery is in a tight spot. And particularly if the specs change, because you can't just take the sulfur out of fuel. It's a very expensive exercise to undertake. It changes the entire process. So you virtually land up with what for a bus would be a rebuild. You're putting a new engine into that bus. You can keep the chassis. Maybe you can dress up the seats a bit, but it's an expensive exercise, and you need to get it right, or it's a disaster. So MARPOL is going to probably cause diesel prices to rise. There will probably be increasing taxes to support government expenditure. And there's going to be very little fuel switching in South Africa. I don't see natural gas being a big player in the short term. At the end of the 20-year time frame, definitely. But within the next 5 years, you won't see it. So the summary, your price is going to rise up. There are the major factors for it. You will get continued supply without any hiccups. And to give you, at the moment, a rough concept of how much diesel is used by the bus fraternity, it's around about 10% of the diesel. So that's a significant amount of diesel. If you want to look at petrol, minibuses around about 20% of petrol. And petrol and diesel volume total in South Africa, you saw on the previous slide, slightly higher on the diesel side because of what buses and industry do, but much the same scale of number. And that's it. I'm free for questions about this or anything related to it. There are refineries that produce Seftel is able to manufacture, Secunda. I need to differentiate between the two. Secunda can manufacture diesel at less than 10 if they choose to. Natref can probably produce limited quantities of 50 ppm locally, and I believe SAPREF and CHEVREF can. NREF cannot. So that's the current physical status, but the volumes that can be produced are relatively low. So the majority of the 50 ppm that is put to the market has been imported. It might well have been imported at a much lower sulfur level than 50, but the regulation requires that the label says 50.
One of your, on the slide that sort of tells us that the fuel price is going to increase. The first item you had there was crude. Your prediction, what's going to happen to the price of crude over the next year or two?
I don't actually have a prediction. I think it's going to stay stable at around about $60 a barrel for a wide number of reasons, but the price of crude has become largely a political and government power struggle. It's not a natural market force. That's what I believe. I think the US is deliberately trying to drive some changes in the way the world behaves.
Good or bad for us?
For us, to the extent that they drive the price down, it's good for South Africa, with the proviso that we direct the funding that we used to spend on oil to something productive for South Africa. We must not waste the opportunity. So to the extent that you were shipping $40 a barrel on all the crude that we import offshore, and getting nothing more than the fuel we need, that $40 a barrel can be put to power generation, housing, roads, anything, but it's a significant amount of money. I would say if you buy fuel once a year or less frequently than that, hedging is quite a good idea, providing that that purchase is significant, that you're unable to tolerate risk. If it is something that you do every day or very frequently, and it is just a piece of the business, I don't understand why you should pay effectively an insurer to protect you from rising fuel, and you will pay the penalty on the way down. So you should come out quits. If you look at the crude oil price, it doesn't only have an upward trend. It seems to go up and down and be fairly flat. So if one has a long-term view and you're going to be buying it for the next 20 years, I don't see the point of paying an insurer premiums for 20 years when you're going to get nothing back. Well, bear in mind, I'm not a hedging expert, because that is a business risk issue. It's not actually a pricing issue. You know, the shifts are generally not that large. There have been a few shock increments, but generally it trends one way and trends the other. I'm pretty sure that you can manage those increments. SAA hedged. I don't know why they hedged. I know that this is not the first time that they have lost a significant amount of money by not understanding what's going on and taking the wrong hedge. Because it actually gets down to betting. If you don't structure your hedging correctly, you're simply betting. I'm betting it'll go up or down. I don't think that's good business. But that's a little off my territory. But I have views on everything. And as I said, you need to blame me, Neil, for the views, not ENGEN. There's actually a very open document which is published by DOE, which demonstrates their pricing mechanism. Now, the pricing mechanism for diesel in South Africa is not driven directly off crude, but indirectly off crude. Because what it relies on is there are what are called import markets. So there's a Singapore market, which is like the Johannesburg market for vegetables, where everyone sells vegetables. And that market will tend to have a market price for mealies or tomatoes or potatoes. Now, those same markets in Singapore, in the Mediterranean and the Aegean, have prices for diesel and petrol and various other petroleum products. So that's the benchmark price, which is used to say, fine, if you have to pay $50 there for the diesel, it's going to cost you $10 a barrel to bring it here on a ship. It costs you $1 in port fees or whatever to get it offshore, and then there is that workup methodology, including the exchange rate, which determines the price. So the relationship is not directly with crude, it's indirect, and that indirect relationship is the refining margin. And you saw the slide which shows that refining margins drift. So if the refining margin is high or drifting higher and the crude price drifts higher, you will see a large increase in the diesel price. And if it goes the other way, it will shrink. Does that help? Okay. Can you give me a prediction for the rand-dollar exchange rate? Because, we start with an offshore dollar price. We calculate nominal prices for shipping and other costs, and then they get converted into this rand thing, which we pay when we go to our supplier.
Last question. Last question at the back.
Well, you can hedge an exchange rate if you choose to, but again, as I was saying, this is depending on your risk appetite and how you manage it. So if one says, well, I'm in the business, I do this all the time, I can manage it, then you can choose not to hedge it or pay the premium for the cost of the hedge and assume that you've taken the right bet on whether it's rising or falling. So I can't tell you how to do it. But my view is if it's a continuous process and it is net even, in other words, a net flat value, then why hedge it? If you happen to spot a rising trend and you firmly believe it's going to rise continuously for 12 months or 3 years, then hedging can be a very good instrument.
Neil, thank you very much. Thanks for sharing your knowledge with us. It was very interesting. We appreciate it. And Neil, unfortunately, has got to go, so that's why we handle these questions now. Neil, thanks again.
My pleasure. Thanks for listening.
Our next speaker is Lisa Seftel. We just want to give her 2 minutes to load her presentation quickly, and then we'll start with it. Okay, the second part of our session deals with BRT, and as I said, this is structured around what we do in the SABOA Operations Committee, and the introduction of BRT is quite an important point on our agenda these days. And it's obviously a huge challenge in most of South African cities, and it certainly covers all those factors that Jack van der Merwe mentioned this morning, which is continuous change, complexity, and competition. It's all in there when you start introducing BRT. We in Cape Town have ourselves experienced the birth pains of getting taxis and buses together with the City of Cape Town and to find a workable solution for the implementation of BRT. It is therefore important for operators and city officials alike to learn from other cities and to see what they've experienced and what lessons they've learned. So we are privileged to have Lisa Seftel, who's going to tell us about the lessons they've learned in Johannesburg. And Lisa is a person whose opinion SABOA values and valued over time. Her opinion is also supported by some strong credentials, including that of being a political and trade union activist some years ago, and being a district municipal manager, and also held several government positions, including positions in the Gauteng Department of Transport. Lisa is currently an executive director of transportation for the city of Johannesburg, and as you know, Johannesburg is introducing BRT. So Lisa, we look forward to hear what you've got to say. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, and thank you for SABOA for inviting me to speak this afternoon. Also, I see quite a lot of familiar faces around the room. Hi. You know, when Eric invited me, or SABOA invited me, and then I phoned Eric about 3 weeks ago, and I said, Eric, what are you doing putting me together with the fuel price? What sense does that make? You know? And besides, Philip van Reineveld speaking the next day. He says, no, Lisa, don't worry. It'll all be explained to you when he sends the final program. Anyway, the final program didn't change much, but he did give me some points about the things he thought I should talk about. And then I thought, oh my God, I'm walking right into the trap of all the small bus operators who are feeling so upset that they can't be regarded as an affected operator. So I thought, no, I'm not walking into that trap. So I've talked a lot about something about the lessons, but I've tried. So how does it go? Oh, there we go. So I'm going to do a brief, very brief, because I'm sure many of you are familiar, overview of the BRT, some overview of the implementation of the first 2 phases, some lessons, and then I'm going to really look at it through the prism of what we're now doing. And in that way, yes, to be able to give some pointers to bus operators, even though some of them we talk a lot about. I believe you did a very good job this morning chairing the meeting. Bro, what? I'm misinformed. No, from good authority, bro. So these are the objectives of the Rea Vaya, and one of the things which we struggle with and create a lot of complexity is the fact it's not only about providing transport, it's about transport transformation, spatial restructuring, broad-based economic transformation, reducing carbon emissions, and creating a livable and competitive city. Really, we've actually been in this game for quite a long time now. 2006, the city agreed the concept. 2007, it was also supported by a number of national national documents. We started operating in 2009 with the first phase, the second phase in 2013, and we are now implementing a third phase. And really, in this third phase, we are trying to embrace more than BRT and really looking at even more inclusive and broad-based public transport transformation. So here, as I said, are some key facts and figures for those of you who may not be so familiar. We're on 3 phases. Our first phase, 2009, as I said, second, October 2013, third phase to be confirmed, but hopefully 2017. But some of you who may have listened very carefully to the Minister's budget speech and looked at the allocations, the BRT systems are not being as well supported as they were in earlier years. There you can see the number of kilometers of trunk route, the feeders and complementary routes. Something about, that's a bit of a misleading impression about feeder and complementary routes. For example, in the third phase, we have no feeders, only complementary, which means that all our routes will start on the curbside and end up in the median. Number of buses, and again you can see that while phase 1 and phase 2, similar numbers. Our third phase, we're looking at doubling the numbers. Number of stations, interestingly, most in phase 1A, and we're reducing the number of stations. And that has got to do with a number of different reasons, including operational sustainability. Passengers per day, I stopped at phase 1B, because in fact, this passenger number thing, and we can talk about it, it's quite a difficult thing to be able to benchmark. Because if you look at average passengers over a year, then you have to take into account Christmas Day, you have to take into account a strike, and once you take into account your numbers go down. We think that on an ordinary normal day in phase 1B, we're probably at about 45,000, but obviously if you average it, the numbers become quite different. Just a recap on the routes. The first document shows the phase 1A and B routes. You can see it's mostly east-west alignment from Soweto to the CBD. And now we're going completely differently. We're going north. And the purple line, does this work here? Yeah, this purple line actually is the Ekurhuleni BRT. So this is the CBD. Here is Alexandra. This is going towards Greenstone. This is going towards Sandton, to Randburg, to Sunninghill, and then also to Ivory Park and to Midrand. The trunk for 2017 is here and here, but we hope the trunk to Randburg will be 2018. We are on a race with Gautrain. You know, they also want to go to Randburg, but we think we might get there a bit sooner than them. And then Sunninghill and these, we haven't got the exact timings, but our target date is 2028. Or for trunk. Not all of them will be trunk, but and we might, bearing in mind there's a lot of new developments here, realign, do a new trunk alignment. Okay, so the topic was BRT negotiations. We prefer to talk about bus operating company formation and empowerment. Again, this is really just an introduction that I think that we know that a key city objective was to empower, particularly the previously disadvantaged minibus taxi industry. And to be honest, we're unapologetic about that. Because the bottom line is, I think I'll put it somewhere else, maybe not here, 70% of people in our city, if not more, still use minibus taxis. So if you want to be able to make a difference for public transport for the majority of our people, we've got to be looking at that sector. There was also recognition that we wouldn't be able to introduce BRT if they're not offered a deal where they wouldn't be worse off. And so based on this and the national legislation, we'll be looking at a one-off negotiated contract. Buses would be owned and financed by the operator, but the procurement finance would be arranged by the city. That was for the first phase. And then for both phases, disadvantaged operators would be paid some form of transformation premium, and that kind of transformation premium has also changed from phase 1A to phase 1B and maybe even phase 1C. Here I've just looked at the process of negotiation, and again I won't go through it in a lot of detail, but the first one we were really finding our feet. The second one was a process which was greater, more codified, greater mandating, and obviously the big difference between the first phase and the second phase was that first phase was only minibus taxis, the second involved PATCO, as well as Metrobus, although they were not involved in the negotiations, only in the engagement process, as well as claims of effectiveness from small bus operators. So, yeah, I won't go through the details. I have to say that, you know, despite the fact that we have a more codified process, in fact, the phase 1B negotiations have taken longer, and not necessarily more conflictual, but I think it does lead, and we still have to conclude them, but I think, you know, even Bram, you may concur that if you want to have good negotiations, you've got to have good, strong leaders who are capable of getting mandates. And in the minibus taxi industry, particularly to the death of one of the key leaders in the negotiations, since then, there was a lot of loss of momentum, and when there isn't clear leadership and ability to have mandates, things do slow down. In both 1A and to some extent already in 1B, the negotiated contract involves a number of agreements. Obviously, the key agreement is the bus operating contract agreement, which lasts 12 years and includes a fee per kilometer. We've also agreed on a participation framework agreement, which is the key agreement which works out how operators will become shareholders in the bus operating company, as well as dispose of their taxis and licenses, or vehicles and licenses. PATCO doesn't dispose of their vehicles, but they take their vehicles off the route. An employment framework agreement, which deals a lot with displaced workers, as well as how to access other opportunities, a value chain agreement which the operators can benefit. And then in phase 1A, we've had a negotiation closure agreement. How do you do the transition? We might call it in phase 1B a handover agreement. And then we also, which is very important, had an interim services agreement, how things will be managed in the interim, because both with phase 1A and phase 1B, we started with interim arrangements. At the moment, phase 1B is operating, but with a management agreement with the phase 1A operator, Piotrans. Just a little bit, some of the features. In phase 1A, the operators are owning the buses. In phase 1B, the city owns the buses for the first 5 years, and the buses may be transferred at a fair market value if the operators perform. And this is, a difficult thing, but I think it does create additional incentive to make sure that people continue to, the shareholders remain seized with making sure that the company performs. So the MAT regulations are the municipal asset transfer regulations. But I read now in the DORA things that were published yesterday, is that if the city is going to buy the buses, not yesterday, last week, Wednesday, if the city is going to buy buses, then they have to own the buses over the whole period. It's something that we still need to get our heads around. On bus financing, the first phase was funded, as most people know, by BINDES. For the second phase, and it's been much simpler and easier, the city bought the buses with cash. Bus operations, on both of them, the buses are operating on a schedule provided by the city. And then on monitoring and step-in, the city has had step-in monitoring rights with Piotrans. We've never exercised the step-in, although we've been tempted from time to time, because the moment the city steps in, the risk transfers to the city, and we don't want that. Now the 1B guys, and the reason why we had monitoring and step-in rights was mostly because we had a finance lease, and the city also had a hell and high water guarantee. For 1B, there is no financing involved, and so the operators have argued that they want even less monitoring rights, so we will not be able to go to their board meetings, but we'll still be able to see their annual financial statements. Now, this issue, risks and rewards, is really an issue that we've got to get our head around in the South African context. Phase 1A, there were guaranteed minimum kilometers, there was no patronage risk. The key issue was penalties, and they're required to do a management plan as a condition precedent. 1B, it's quite similar, but the management plan is less prescriptive, and there is more responsibility for them to do the management plan. However, I must say, our city manager and we are going to renegotiate it for phase 1 and phase 1B, is some form of patronage incentive. And not so much because it'll make them try to get their workers back sooner when there's a strike, but also because the same shareholders, with impunity, I believe, they are putting taxis on the same routes. And because it doesn't matter to them, they can get money from the tax on the one side and on the other side. They are getting paid a fee per kilometer. And the buses are not as full as we'd like them to be. So we are very seriously wanting to negotiate a patronage incentive for both phases. Shareholder payments. The shareholders are remunerated through a restraint of trade. The city was sort of, how can I call it, paying for the first 4 years for Piotrans up until such time as the company made a profit. So this month was the first month where the shareholders got paid a restraint of trade on a monthly basis from, or maybe they didn't get paid, Javier? They did get paid. A restraint of, but they're getting paid on a monthly basis. I'm not sure what amount they got paid. That's now the decision of the shareholders, what amount they get paid monthly. But it is linked to the amount of profit that the company is making. In phase 1B, the model is that they can make profit from day one because there's no bus financing involved. And as I understand, the phase 1B model, not fully negotiated, is that there will be a dividend. I'm not sure how the dividend will be paid out 6 months or annually. The shareholders will need to decide. As well as the empowerment premium, they now want, although again it's not fully negotiated, to get as a lump sum. So what are the lessons from phase 1A? Particularly with something so new, strong, determined leadership from all stakeholders is critical. The process of determining which operators must be inclusive and involve leadership, because we're still feeling the effects of it wasn't that inclusive, and there were still people that feel that they're outside. And even as late as last week, I had a delegation in my office from UTAF telling me that they have got to be able to use the rear via lanes, and feeling very upset that Pat and Bartle, which was the taxi lane given to them by the apartheid government, is now being taken away from them and given to the rear via by the democratic government. But the big issue which has come up is that the operators are very keen that the board must be 100% made up of shareholders, no independent shareholders. And it's very difficult to have good governance and good board decisions when your shareholders are also sometimes employees, they've got drivers who are employees, that are their relatives, and there's no independent board members who can be able to provide strong governance leadership. On 1B, as I said, we're still busy. The seat allocation process, it calls, the seat allocation process is a model. It's a mechanism. And it's a very important mechanism because it's a mechanism which will say you have an economic right and you don't have an economic right. But so it took a long time. And we don't even know now, to be honest. Please, nobody must now. Gosh, there's Patco, very litigious, oh dear. But it's a model. Now, it anticipates passenger behavior. Which passengers will leave the taxis and go into the buses? Now we see, for example, on some routes they're chock-a-block, on other routes they're empty, but we still we took off the same amount of taxis from the different routes. And so there is something to be said about what Cape Town has been looking at doing on the Khayelitsha route. Is first you operate the service, you see, which passengers are moving, and then you take off those taxis. So we really do need to think very seriously, and we are looking very seriously as we go forward on an appropriate model. The small bus operators, learner transport, they have tried very hard to claim that they're affected. And again, when should you say you're affected? Our model worked on some day in the past you could be affected. So now they learn a transport, they go to all the principals, and the principals give them little letters that say, yes, no, a lot of our students are using the rear via, but that's not the call. The call is, were you transporting kids 3 years ago at a date in the past which would make you eligible to be an affected operator? So we have a lot of issues and the matter is still ongoing. We have offered both the SSGR, which the SABOA, Southern Transvaal, Gauteng region, small bus operators, Southern Transvaal, Southern Gauteng region. We have offered them job opportunities in the company, and we'd very much like them to join, but they are holding out for the offer of shares or equity. And our view is that the NLTA is very clear. It's giving an economic right, and you have to be very careful about who you give those economic rights to. As well as participation in a broader public transport restructuring, which we can talk about more. Again, the value chain is something, which is quite difficult. But we are thinking of broadening what we could call value chain opportunities. But the thing is that it's very difficult to say to a big community, all who don't have enough jobs, don't have enough income. No, the depots are going to be only the people in the depots. The people who wash the bus in the depots are only going to be taxi drivers, relatives, or ex-drivers, and so on. It's very difficult to say that. Because the community says, but this depot is in our community. Why can't our mamas that don't have jobs also, do that? Similarly with station staff. So it's a very contested terrain. So then just, how much time do I have? I'm fine. Okay. In terms of phase 1C, as I said, we've learned a lot of lessons. And so we want to go towards both greater integration and greater transformation. So the first thing, which I'm sure all bus operators must welcome, and taxi operators, we'll have 3 kinds of dedicated lanes. The first one is the BRT, only for the BRT, because the BRT promise is about speed. But, I don't know if I've got a picture. Yeah, I do. But this is in Sandton. In Sandton, the BRT will come in the middle, all the way up to down Catherine, to the up here to the Gautrain station, and then going on to Randburg. But then there'll be a public transport loop, and that loop will be available for all public transport vehicles. It'll be curbside, and we will have commuter shelters and places for people to buy tickets all the way around the loop. Then we'll also have, in the morning, temporary lanes for minibus taxis going to Brightwater Commons and going to Monte Cassino. Hopefully, we're busy doing the study now as well. So we'll have 3 kinds of dedicated lanes. We're also doing a number of bridge widenings, and this bridge will be a dedicated bridge for BRT walking and cycling. There's another bridge that we launched this morning, which will only be for walking and cycling. We'll also have a lot of more interchanges, again, where there is a possibility of interchange between different modes. At Westgate in the CBD will be BRT rail and minibus taxi. We've already upgraded the minibus taxi and metro and ordinary bus station at Westgate. At Alexandra, this is the Watt Street. This is what it looks like now. We're going to be completely transforming this, and on this patch of land, we are going, this patch of land here, we're going to be putting a underground interchange for buses, and then this will be residential, this will be offices, linked to with very strong connections to the Pan-African Mall, and a 5-kilometer dedicated walking and cycling route going all the way to Sandton. And then we'll have similar interchanges at Midrand, Greenstone, Mtomjeni, and as I think I showed you about Sandton. We're also looking at better integration at Gandhi Square between BRT and Metrobus, and Waterfall Mall going into the future. In the Sandton CBD, this is really the slide on this page. I talked about the public transport loop. The green is cycling lanes, and the yellow is walking. No, the yellow is cycling lanes. The green is walking priority, and really restricting private cars only to access. And then the blue will remain the mobility network. We're also going to have integrating depots. We'll still have BRT depots at Selby and Alexandra and Midrand, but those depots, particularly for holding, can be used by anybody with a contract with the city. So Metrobus can also use holding facilities. And then we're looking at exploring gas filling stations at depots to be used by all forms of public transport. Then in terms of transformation and economic empowerment, we want to see all public transport operators transformed, and we want this transformation to be broad-based, touching big and small owners. So our proposals to do this include the BRT in certain corridors. We have a Mayoral Committee approved restructuring for Metrobus, and where Metrobus will also have trunk routes and secondary services, and a lot of the routes which Metrobus operate now, which we call feeder, we want to stop operating them and ask the minibus taxis to operate those. We want also to have a program, which we're talking to the taxi industry about, of converting minibus taxis to dual fuel. It's easier than buses, and there's a lot of dividends in terms of reduced costs and improved maintenance. Opportunities in the management and maintenance of all those new facilities I talked about, opportunities in the value chain, obviously decent jobs for drivers and other workers. And then one thing which is very important that we've learned a lot for the BRT is that lots and lots of training and capacitation so that people can play new roles and functions. So the Northeast Quadrant, which is where Phase 1C is, we would want to have a better integration of scheduled services, non-scheduled services, last mile services, learner services, and facilities management, with minibus taxis playing an integral role, but here also an important role for small bus operators. So the way we've been doing it is we're in the process of developing a high-level network where we can allocate across the city the appropriate mode and for each route, and then we have gone out for tender, and we've in fact awarded for somebody to do a detailed integrated public transport operational plan, which will look at which services should be operated by Rea Vaya, Metrobus, small bus, minibus taxis, and these 4-in-1s or Avanzas. We don't only want to look at legal taxis, but make sure that we're able to look at the whole issue of demand and how to match increasing public demand, maybe a single public transport company, infrastructure improvements for all modes, merging, consolidation, corporatization, and a new business model for associations, introducing green and improving fuel efficiency, and this will all have to come. We have to bite this bullet. And we've also got a process in the city to develop a new regulation and enforcement strategy. Otherwise, all the rest can fail. So then lastly, what are the pointers for the bus industry? Very importantly, to understand our model for integration of public transport transformation, understand the dynamics in the city, where still the model which carries the vast majority of passengers is minibus taxis, and where ongoing instability and lack of empowerment can take the whole public transport sector down, work within the legal framework of the NLTA, and participate in the forums that the city has set up, even if they're not on the days that you may like. This is Patco says, no, they don't come to meetings because they have their own meetings on Monday. They only like to go to meetings on a Wednesday or whatever the case may be. You know, about working in these forums is about compromise. It is time consuming. It is it's embracing a different culture. It requires a lot of change management. Thank you. Gotta get my notebook. So, how long will it take to get you into the system? Okay. You must take one question at a time. Oh, okay. Well, it depends where you live and where you operate. And okay, let me not go into any more details. But what we say in terms of the BRT and commuter, you know, the BRT and Metrobus and minibus taxis, short commuters, they are commuter forms of transport. If you are a small bus operator doing commuter services, okay, now if you're doing scholar transport, we've looked at this a lot, okay? Scholar transport, well, there's a few kinds. The one kind is where you've got a subsidized contract from the GDE. And generally, those contracts are in areas which at the moment are not necessarily serviced by the BRT. If you had a subsidized contract serviced by an area linked to the BRT, and all the parents, because the other thing about scholar learner transport is that the parents stand outside their house with the child, put the child on the bus, usually primary school kids. Then, on the other side, they know the child is going to get off in the school premises. So, but if all the parents say, we are fine with our children getting on to a commuter bus system, then you could be regarded as an affected operator. Okay? That's a GDS service. Then there are services which are contracted by schools, you know, and often those bus services, they take the kids to sport and to tours. That kind of service will never be covered by the BRT because it's a very different kind of service. Then there are services that are commissioned by parents, although it's less bus, that's more minibus taxis, you know, all those other terrible things, whatever you call them, that should be taken off the roads. Those ones, again, the parents, despite the lack of safety, the parents pay because it picks the child up and it fetches the child. And the bus will wait at the school until the last child is ready to get back onto the bus or minibus taxi. So again, that's unlikely ever to be covered by a commuter service. A small bus operator, sure. And Patco, that's great, you know, to the extent that Patco brings you into the service because you have a bus that can be made available for a service that I presume Patco needs you as a subcontractor about. So remember what I was trying to explain about 1C is that in 1C we don't only want to look at the narrow, how can I put it, where somebody, in terms of Section 41 of the NLTA, you're an affected operator, you get rid of your license, you get rid of your vehicle, and you become a shareholder in a bus company. Okay, that kind of integration, it's very hard for people from the learner transport environment. However, if you look here in phase 1C, we are looking at operational plan where it could be, I'm still not convinced about the learner transport, but I could see, for example, that we could, or the public transport operating company or the city could contract directly with small bus operators, for example, to offer services down the ride. You know? But the reality is that the city is involved in commuter transport. You know? So that's where we can engage and look at opportunities for more regular contracting. Okay. Okay, let me try to answer the question. Okay, I think that your point is very important, and as I understand, at least I know with PATCO, they have, as a requirement, I think from the tender process, the contractual process was not, we don't tender with PATCO. We don't contract PATCO, the province does. But there have been efforts to get big operators to subcontract with smaller operators. Okay? So, yes, that does happen, and yes, that should be supported to enable small operators to get greater opportunities and to learn and become big operators eventually. There are a lot of problems with the provincial subsidized contracts, which I'm not really empowered to speak about because I'm coming from the city. Where Metrobus is concerned, Metrobus is a public operator, and the law about public operators or any public-owned company is that they are not really able to subcontract, other smaller contractors. However, exactly the process that you're talking about, we are now looking at because we are restructuring Metrobus, but it won't be. But what we're saying is that we will relinquish some routes which would be traditional Metrobus routes. We will rather say that let minibus taxis operate them, and if we can get into a proper engagement with minibus taxi people, we can even look at, like some kind of subsidy for that in the same way that the city subsidizes Metrobus, because we're moving to a fee per kilometre subsidy. So that is where we're going. It is a very slow process to be able to do that. And I suppose in that context, we would, if there were small bus operators with the capacity who have run those services as commuter services, we could also offer them, subsidized contracts on some routes. But the bottom line is in Johannesburg, the major mode is minibus taxis. And I don't know of any small bus operator in Johannesburg with trips origin and destination in Johannesburg that operates commuter services. I know some like J.R. Chui who come out from Ekurhuleni, but the last time there was an attempt was in Diepsloot, and Rulta kicked the bus operators out. So that's the environment in which we need to engage with and work on. Okay. I think your points are absolutely correct. I think that there is a threat. There is a very real threat to the viability of the BRT if there is no proper regulatory and enforcement system. And in fact, ever since we started the BRT, we were very cognizant of it. Now as we're on to phase 1B and so on, we are more cognizant of it, and we have to look at it. I think the issue is that, our executive mayor is a very forward-thinking person. We've all had 20 years of transformation. And I think one of the biggest lessons of 20 years of transformation is that 20 years of transformation doesn't bring us to a utopia. That these kinds of transformational things are long, they're complicated, and they're difficult. But if we care for a future for our children, which is going to be greener, cleaner, and where we're not going to succumb to the other option, which is the private car and high levels of congestion, this is a route that we have to go on. So that's why I'm saying to you, as we go forward, on the one hand, there's this issue, as I said, about tackling the law enforcement and regulation, and the other hand is about building increased inclusivity. So we have to have a plan, like we have, not like we had in Soweto, only for BRT. We have to have a plan for every mode in an area in which we work. And it is a big challenge. But I think, it's a challenge that, as a city of Johannesburg, we believe that it is better to tackle than to accept defeat. But your points are, it's true, it's difficult. Okay, look, it's not an easy thing, and it's also a little bit different. But I'll try and just explain the key principles. Okay? So, where we came from with the BRT, we came from the experience of the minibus taxis and Metrobus. Okay? The view was that we want to be able to have a quality service. And the international experience about a quality service is that we mustn't expect the operator to run after passengers, because then they speed, or then they don't service routes where there's no passengers. Okay? So we said we will pay a fee per kilometer. Okay? So, and if the company, when will you not get a fee per kilometer? If you don't run kilometers. So if your buses break down a lot, you don't run a fee per kilometer. To create an incentive to make sure your buses don't break down. And then we said, but we'll also have a penalty system. And there's a whole big system to manage it. So if you speed, you get a penalty. If you don't open your door for a passenger, you get a penalty. If you don't maintain your buses and they break down, there's no kilometers. So that was how we wanted to incentivize the company to be able to make sure that they've got money and make sure that they've got kilometers. Okay. So then we said, so now the company will get paid a fee per kilometer, and we developed a business model that, particularly if you are doing bus financing, after you've paid off your bus financing in the later years, it could be quite lucrative. And the other thing that a big important principle learned from Bogota is that you must allow the bus operator to maintain their buses themselves. And then they get very good, because if you ask Mercedes to maintain the bus, well, they'll just change the carburetor. What do you call these big things? Carburetor or something after 5 years anyway. They won't think, do I really need to change this? I'm sure those of you bus operators, you understand. That was the thinking. Then we said, so now the bus operator must now pay the shareholders. Okay? Now, usually in a modern company, the shareholders would bring in their own equity, they would take their own risks, and they would get, if there was profit, they'd take a dividend. But now those phase 1A guys said, we've been getting money every day from our taxis. We can't get money every 6 months. It can't work like that. So we then structured something really complicated where they get paid, and we went to the receiver of revenue, a restraint of trade on a monthly basis. But the source of the money is the profit. But the mechanism is a restraint of trade. The other advantage of the restraint of trade is that you can then also restrain the minibus taxi people from carrying on their trade, which is using the money they get from the restraint of trade to buy more taxis to come back into the system. Okay? However, implementing the restraint of trade relies on enforcement. So that's where the system is not working as it should. As I understand in Cape Town, I don't know if, there are people here from Cape Town, but in Cape Town there's you're in the bus operating company Cape Town, but in Cape Town I think that they've got a lump sum payment, and then the Cape Town people are better on enforcement, and if they find one of your taxis, they have got a contractual right to go and claim that lump sum payment back from you. Okay, that's the theory. Whether anybody has had to relinquish their lump sum payment, I'm not yet sure. No. Okay. So that's the essence of the model. In our 1B, we're trying to do it slightly differently. But yeah, it's not fully negotiated. But I think I'm explaining to you the principles. Okay. Yes. I think you're exactly right. Sure. Yeah, you're absolutely right. And if you look at this as what we want to do, is that, and in fact, it's just that we are trying to get a mayoral committee approval. When people think rear via, they mustn't think rear via BRT. They must think rear via quality public transport. You know? So that's why in 1C, like what we were launching today was a cycling and walking lane. That we want also to look at upgrading the minibus taxis. If they use this dual fuel, they use gas. It's cheaper than diesel. Well, it depends on the price of diesel, I heard, but it potentially is. And your vehicles can be better maintained using gas than diesel. So that then they can afford to be able to maybe buy bigger vehicles and things like that. So that's exactly the strategies that we are looking at going forward. We talk all the time to other cities. Earlier on today, I was in a telephone conference with Durban around the fare collection system. We are under a lot of pressure from the National Department of Transport also to go low floor. So we've extensively engaged with Cape Town about the pros and cons of low and high floor because they've got both systems. Possibly it would have been better, possibly, that we all we started with low. It's very difficult for us now to move from high to low. Most because the big movement in Joburg is Soweto to Sandton. So if we now have low floor in Sandton and high floor from Soweto, everybody from Soweto would have to transfer somewhere in the CBD. And one thing that we want to get away from is we want people, especially for BRT, fast, safe, reliable. We're cutting down on the stations. BRT must be that long haul, because of our apartheid patterns, that can take people quickly. So that's why we want to remain with the high floor in Johannesburg. Look, yeah. Look, I'm sure that Javier can have a word or two about that. Because as operators, if I were to say, being the employer or the client, that it is an important discussion that you need to have as operators. You probably have forums to do it, particularly in the bargaining council. Why are there more strikes? I'm sure there's a combination of factors. The overall instability in the country, the inter-union tensions, which exist definitely in the Pytrans case, and I'm sure exist in relationship to SABOA, which is a reflection of the broader problems about CSIR and again, the broader tensions within our political environment. The challenge, and PATCA doesn't go on strike very often, is that the other challenge that we face is, how can I put it? Well, I've told Javier, I said, no, I don't think I've told Javier, but I've told his boss, where you have onbeskof workers, you have onbeskof management, unruly, like, and I come from the trade union movement and I've worked in the Department of Labor. So that's where I come from when I say this. That, but bearing in mind the fact that the sea is turbulent, you in the bus industry as skippers have to be very skilled. But it can still happen. And bus drivers all over the world know how powerful is their power. That's why some countries go to rail internationally. Why do you think, there was, those bus drivers and train drivers in England before Thatcher were powerful. Why did Margaret Thatcher focus so much on emasculating that industry? So those are the kind of things but you guys in the industry do need to talk about it, I think, because it does give the biggest problem with this is that it gives public transport a bad name. Overseas increasingly, people are making choices that they don't have to have a car because there is so much public transport. If they need a car, they get a zip car, or they short-term rental, all these kinds of things. Or they use e-hailing and Uber and whatever. The bottom line is that, but their main mode is public transport. Then there's complementary mode, is the Uber and the e-hailing and the whatever. But in Johannesburg, at least, and in probably most cities, people cannot rely on public transport as a reliable alternative that will always be there. And therefore, they still make decisions to make very big investments in the private car. My final point just here, because, is that I was listening to a financial advisor and over in the radio last night, I think on SFM or something. He was saying that the decision of your first car impacts on your retirement, how much money you have for retirement. So if you insist on buying a very expensive car, you don't have enough money for retirement. So imagine the contribution that we can make to the savings culture and the prosperity of our elderly people if people didn't have to spend a lot on their first car. Thanks.
Lisa, thank you very much. This is a very, please. This is a difficult subject, and I think there's a lot of expectation was created by government that everybody's going to get rich in this, and that makes it more difficult. What we have found in Cape Town is when we signed the final contracts that both bus and taxi operators were equally unhappy, and I think that's the best solution you can hope for. Thank you once again.
Thank you. Do you want me to save this on the